Grace to you and peace from God our Father and our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. From the very beginning of this country, our founding fathers proposed the Constitution with a balance of power in mind. Balance of power, of course, means that you're distributing the authority to rule different people and entities. And so to this very day in our country, there's a balance of power between the federal government and each individual state government. And there's also a balance of power worked into the federal system as well. That's why we have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judiciary branch. These three groups are supposed to act as checks and balances for one another so that it prevents any one person or small gathering of people to have too much control at the same time. The founding fathers wrote the Constitution this way because they realized how corrupt a monarchy could become if all power was 100% centralized in one person. That hasn't stopped corruption. Of course, it's not a perfect system. There will always be plans and plots and schemes to grab as much influence and control as possible on any level. And there are always going to be people who abuse their power, and there are always going to be people who misuse the authority they have been given. That's why these checks and balances need to be in place, because even the most honest and hardworking public servants in our political system need to have their simple nature checked. Today, of course, we are celebrating Christ the King Sunday. And it didn't dawn on me until this past week, but maybe this concept of Christ the King would be a little bit disturbing to some people in this country. Even for us as Christians, who know what these passages say about Christ the King. And we've sung the songs about Christ the King, and we believe that Christ is the King. Sometimes even we can be a little bit unsettled by how the Lord has set things up. Because we're used to a balance of power. We're used to these checks and balances, but there are no checks and balances with the Lord. He's it. We're used to term limits, and we're used to elections, and we're used to voicing our concerns when we don't like how things are going, but there are no term limits with Christ the King. And there never will be an election by popular vote, and it doesn't matter if we don't like what is going on. Christ is the King. All power is 100% centralized in Him. All authority begins and ends at His throne. This is no democracy. In fact, it is unlike anything else any other country has ever come up with in this world. God rules. The Lord reigns. Christ is the King, and there is no other. We saw earlier that Daniel had the privilege of watching this coronation of Christ the King in his vision, and he saw how comprehensive Christ's rule really is. Here are these words again from Daniel chapter 7. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into His presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped Him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Christ the King is unlike any other ruler that has ever lived. He has been given all authority, all glory, and all power. All people are one day going to be obligated to bow down and worship Him. His dominion, which means His right and privilege to rule, is never going to be taken away. And He has a kingdom that is never going to be invaded, never going to be taken over, and never going to be destroyed. Christ the King is in control of all things. Christ the King has the final say in every matter. Christ the King has total supremacy in every single way. And there is no other. Whether we like it or not. And sometimes I don't like it. Sometimes I'm not too thrilled with the way things are going. And I'm not too happy about the decisions that my King has been making. There are moments in my life when I think that I could probably do a better job if I were in charge. If I were in charge, then things would be different. If I were in charge, then life would be better. If I were in charge of what Christ is in charge of, then I wouldn't let those that I care about suffer such extreme pain or die horrible deaths. If I were in charge, then I would have more than what I have now. If I were in charge, I would just eliminate all pain and all sorrow and all sin from my life. If I were in charge, then this world would be a much nicer, much more pleasant, much more enjoyable place for me to live. If I were in charge. I don't know what Christ the King is doing up there, but if I were in charge. To even say anything like that is extremely arrogant, isn't it? To claim that if I were in charge of what Christ is in charge of, that anything would actually be better is so preposterous and outrageous that I'd be struck down on the spot for even suggesting such a thing. Because the reality of the situation is, if I were in charge, everything would fall apart in an instant. I don't have the knowledge that Christ the King has, who knows everything all the time. I don't have the power that Christ the King has, who is able to create everything in this world, everything that we see, smell, taste, touch, and feel with the breath of his mouth. I don't have the experience Christ the King has, who has existed from eternity without beginning and without end. If I really were in charge of anything, let alone everything, it would be a disaster. And it would be a complete disaster, not only because I would be incapable of handling such a monumental responsibility, but because I'm selfish. We're all selfish. Some of us more than others, and some of us hide it better than others too. But in the end, each one of us is completely self-absorbed. Can you imagine if any one of us was really in charge of everything without any checks and balances, without having to answer to anyone else, without any repercussions, without any consequences, no matter what you did and when you did it? Well, that'd get ugly. We would make decisions that would benefit us, whether they were good for anyone else or not. We think we know, but we don't really. We think we know what is good, but that's just a guess on our parts and is subject to change. We think we know what we are supposed to do, but let's be honest, sometimes we don't even want to do it. If any one of us were in charge of everything, this world would come crashing down all around us in a flaming heap of wreckage to the detriment and destruction of everyone on this earth in a blink of an eye. It's probably a good thing I'm not in charge. And it's probably a good thing that Christ the King is in charge. Because he never abuses his power. And he never misuses his authority. And all of the glory that he has as the Son of God, he doesn't use for himself. Instead, he uses it for you. There's a really interesting connection between this vision in Daniel chapter 7 and Jesus when he was on this earth. It happened when Jesus was standing in front of the chief priests and the teachers of the law, right before the story we read in the gospel lesson today. He was standing there because he had recently been betrayed by Judas Iscariot and arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane and then chained up by this mob that had been hired to do the dirty work. And so now he was standing in front of the Jewish leaders on trial, and as he was surrounded by these men who hated him and wanted him to die, Jesus quotes this vision in Daniel chapter 7. I'm going to read the very first part of that vision again, and then I'm going to read to you what Jesus said to those Jewish leaders. Here's how Daniel's vision begins. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. This is what Jesus says to these Jewish leaders in those very early morning hours of Friday morning or late Thursday evening. I say to all of you, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Jesus was claiming to be the one whom Daniel saw in that vision 600 years ago. Which means that Jesus was claiming to be the one who had been given all power, all glory, and all authority. Jesus was claiming to be the one whom all people would one day have to bow down and worship. Jesus was claiming to be the one whose right to rule would never be taken away and whose kingdom would never be destroyed. As Jesus stood before the high priest, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders that night, he was claiming to be the king. No matter what kind of power they thought they had over him, no matter what kind of authority they thought they had been given, no matter what kind of control they believed they had over this man from Nazareth, Jesus claimed to be the king. And what did this king, who had all power, in all glory, and all authority, intend to do? Well, this king intended to die. The king who didn't have to answer to anyone. The king who owes no one. The king who isn't dependent on anyone. It was going to use all of his power just to die. That's a strange way to act for an absolute monarch, isn't it? He didn't have to die. He wanted to die. He wasn't forced into the situation. This was his plan all along. The king, who could do anything he wanted, decided to sacrifice everything he had just for you. And so when these chief priests and teachers of law began to mock him and beat him for claiming to be the Son of God, the king did not retaliate. He let them unleash on him their hatred and their anger without a word. And later on, when he stood in front of Pontius Pilate, who asked him if he was the king of the Jews, but Pontius Pilate was far too weak to make the right decision and free an innocent man, the king did not step in, push him aside, and take over. Instead, Jesus allowed the injustice to continue to the point where Jesus was physically tortured. When the crowds began to scream at him and yell at him and spit on him, when his enemies taunted him to come down from the cross, when even the two criminals that were crucified on either side of him heaped on the insults as they hung there dying, the king did not demonstrate his almighty power and end it right there. He held himself back from displaying his godly glory, and instead he continued to let the blood flow. And he continued to let the pain sharpen until that moment when he willingly and knowingly gave up his life. The king, who had been given all power, all glory, and all authority. The king whose dominion will never end. The king whose kingdom will never be destroyed. The king whom all people will one day bow down and worship, decided to die. Is that not strange to you? Doesn't that sound just a little bit weird? When he didn't have to do it. When he was obligated in no way, shape, or form. Why would he do such a thing? Well, he did it for you. Because Christ the King was not concerned about his approval rating. And Christ the King didn't really care about flexing his muscles. The only thing Christ the King cared about was you. That's why Christ the King is no longer dead. He was brilliant enough and he was powerful enough to know that he had to rise from the dead in order to make this work. He didn't just want to take the battle. He wanted to win the war. And the only way that he was going to be able to do that was to die on the cross and then rise from the dead. And because he did, he has earned your forgiveness. He has ensured your salvation. He has confirmed your spot in heaven. Because he is the King. And there is no other. We do not have to be worried at all that all power and all authority and all glory are 100% centralized in Christ. Because even though there is no real balance of power other than him, he serves as his own check and balance. And he does that because he holds himself to his promises. If he promises you something in his word, he's never going to go back on it. He is never going to compromise. If he promises you in his word that you are forgiven because he died on the cross, and you are saved because he rose from the tomb, and you are absolutely, positively going to be in heaven because he has given you the gift of faith to believe in him, you know that's going to happen. You can trust, you can be 100% confident that you are going to end up where Jesus says you are going to end up because he is the King. And he is not just powerful enough to do it. He has the perfect integrity to carry it out every single time. That doesn't mean that we understand everything that the King does, of course. That doesn't mean that we are always going to be able to logically figure out every one of the King's decisions. That doesn't mean that we're always going to see exactly how what the Lord does and what the Lord allows is going to turn out for our good. But we trust that the King knows what he's doing and that the King is always right. Because no one will stop him. No one will hold him back. No one will convince him otherwise. He is the Lord of Lords, after all. He is the King of Kings. And he's not just the King. He's your King.